things like, hey, gravity's 100% reproducible. Everybody who tosses a ball up, you let it go, it drops to the ground. It's an experiment that can be done over and over and over. As long as you're on Earth, it works. So it's kind of a physical law. Well, there's certain things that just, the thing with science and healthcare science is that it's kind of becomes things that are accepted until more data comes around. It's hardly ever settled because we keep learning new things about how the human body works, and there are hypotheses or things that we kind of come out with at points in time where we don't understand everything that we know now. Just like in 20 years, we're going to know so much more than we know now. So the big problem is don't fall in love with a hypothesis and don't fall in love with something because very likely we just don't have enough knowledge yet to understand where we went wrong with the statement. So I wind up determining that in my own mind and through what I believe to be the most credible science available, that one of the reasons why as a society we got so heavy and so diseased over the last 50 years is we've mistakenly not only followed some bad assumptions that were never backed up by randomized clinical trials, RCTs, we actually then legislated and kind of put it into guidelines that all schools and military and hospitals and anybody who kind of gets federal dollars has to follow. And much of this was just absolutely flat out wrong. And so it took me about 60 days to really convince myself that he wasn't following a fad diet and that he actually had something figured out. And so then 1/1 of 2019, I launched headway into it after doing that 8 weeks of research and, came at it with a pretty strong belief system and understanding of why it would work, why it will work. And long story short, I lost 100 pounds in 10 months. I lost 115 total. I've put on about 8 to 10 pounds of muscle. So that's, so even though I've lost 115, there's still 10 extra pounds of muscle on me. Yes. So, all of these different things just kind of come around after 2 months of losing the first 38 pounds. I'm like, oh my God, I was still far from being really thin, but I was like, I might be able to, or I'm starting to look like somebody who doesn't look like the fat cow at a corporate wellness meeting, that I could become looking more like the poster child of an industry instead of the don't let this happen to you part of the industry. And so I started reaching out to friends from the industry and started realizing, oh my God, still most people inside of the corporate wellness world still haven't picked up, and they're still thinking most of the unproven science or hypothesis of the last 50 years. And so I then started determining that, I do want to go back into that industry. And I reached out to a guy who I used to compete with. And I'm like, I sent him a LinkedIn message and he sent me one back within like under 5 minutes, which for the LinkedIn world was so incredibly quick, your head spins. Mm-hmm. And, I just said, hey, Jim, thinking of getting back in the game. Let me know when you have 10 minutes and what's your cell number? And he goes, well, you escaped. Why do you want to come back? Are you crazy? And he gave me his cell number again within 5 minutes. And I called and I just said, hey, I've had an epiphany. I now understand why healthcare costs as much as it does. I understand why most corporate wellness and disease management programs don't work. And I understand how to put them together to make them work. And I go, the company you used to run that I used to compete at you is looking for people. And so I thought you could give me some direction on who I should talk to there. And he's like, well, I left there for certain reasons. And he goes, I'm actually kind of with where you're going with a company that's all about disease reversal. And so I go, wow, that's fascinating. So we started talking about how, with what I learned about all of this, not only is it how do you lose 100 pounds, it's really more about how do you become healthy, how do you reverse pretty much everything that is what we call the metabolic panel or metabolic syndrome, which revolves around your blood pressure revolves around central adiposity, the midsection getting too big, around your glucose levels, and thus leading to type 2 diabetes, which leads to coronary artery disease, which leads to chronic kidney disease, which is the industry I'm now a part of again. And so, I'm just like, Jim, what we thought are chronic progressive diseases that people just need to manage, and start just allowing that with age, you're going to get heavier, you're going to start taking all these meds, you're going to lose your eyesight, you're going to lose a thumb, you're going to lose a leg, you're going to whatever, that those are not natural progressions. Those never happened until we introduced all the processed, terrible food into our world and decided that it's what we should be eating most of the time. And I go, just by eating clean, you can reverse all of these things. And so my company knows and understands and appreciates that, who I've joined up with, even though it's not always 100% easy to move down that path. Even with the knowledge, there's still so much cognitive dissonance out there that people don't always want to pay attention to everything. So it's very exciting. Not only did I reverse I figured out, even though my doctor never told me, I went back and I had 10 years of blood tests, because when you're selling corporate wellness programs, there was a portal where all my stuff was kept from the work ones. And then I went and grabbed the stuff from my health center, from who's now Ascension. And, I put it on a spreadsheet, and I'm looking at these things. I go, they never told me that I was insulin resistance, or that I was insulin resistant. And really, that's the cornerstone of all of these disease states that we call metabolic syndrome. They all start with you're just pounding your body with too much sugar, or foods that metabolize to sugar once it gets into your body. And you eventually become very insulin resistant, and as those cells continue to do that across your body, then they manifest into all of the things we just talked about: hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease. And now they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, because they believe it's just the pounding that actually does go across the blood-brain barrier. Now, the body needs glucose. There is not a doubt, and everybody probably has heard that, you want to keep your sugars up because your brain needs sugar. And that's kind of, while it is true, the body needs glucose. And this is one of the big aha moments that really set in for me. While we need glucose, we don't need to eat anything to get the glucose that we need. Our body, our liver, through a process called gluconeogenesis, creates all of the blood sugar, all of the glucose that we need in the exact perfect amount that we need, because the cells in our body that are not that don't have mitochondria, thus the brain, most of the cells in the brain run just fine on what we call ketones, or healthy fat. As we oxidize and break down fat, we turn it into another metabolic energy source called ketones. And not only does it run on that, it's actually, when we were all in our mother's wombs, our whole bodies were formed in a state of nutritional ketosis, because inside of the womb, that is a ketogenic state. If you come out, when you're born, and as long as you were on your mother's breast milk, you maintain a ketogenic lifestyle as a newborn that's growing and forming brain and all of these things. It's the second that we get off of the mother's milk as their main energy source that they have the opportunity to, depending upon how much juices and things high in sugar and processed food that they start eating, that they start moving away from that and become what we all refer to, or what gets referred to these days as sugar burners. Now, I've been verbally vomiting on you for about 2-3 minutes here, if not longer. Let me take a breath, take a sip of coffee, and let you direct where you want me to go with what I've said so far.
Brett, you hit on everything that I've lived, believed, and have become, because the question I had with my type 2 is, I love history. I always think in history, it's my degree. And I was at the doc, and I'm thinking about this food. What did we eat 100 years ago? How did we live? We didn't have a lot of food. We fast a lot. We didn't eat a lot. People survived. And that's kind of what I started thinking, less. And I started doing the fasting, and that's part of your program there. And I've kind of worked into that in the last 5-6 years. You know, going back to that natural, we lived and gathered and foraged. We didn't have all this food. Or, I'm older, 58, we didn't have this growing up. We ran all day. We are just sitting, and I was one of them. I had that waist. If you take your waist and you double it and you're not that height, boy, you are a ball, and you're going to become a ball. And I was a chalk too, Brett. I did everything, man. I ran when I was young and blah, blah, blah. I hurt my knee. I couldn't do a lot later in life, but I couldn't lose it. You walk, but you still had that pear shape or whatever. Well, through my diabetes, and I remember the nurse said to me once, that could be a good thing for you. Well, I started doing it, eating. My dad got a bunch of apples, and I just started taking little things to school where I was working, apples and plain stuff, not a lot. And next thing you know, you're not craving anything. You're looking at sugar, and you're like, I don't like it. And then the other thing I hit on is body memory. They told me that doctor told me a long time ago, your body's cells reverse in a year. You start going back to what you used to be, less of what we have today, and back to where I eat almonds, walnuts. We're talking all that natural, green tea. Then all of a sudden in a year, wow, things do change. And that's what I picked up exactly what you're saying. I don't know the medical grade stuff that you have. My gosh, man, thank you for coming on today. You're talking what I'm trying to live. And you know the thing, when I started feeling better, then I would tell everybody, and they're like, yeah, whatever, Tom. I'm like, I'm not kidding you. I was so tired from diabetes. You got to just, it's a disease of exhaustion, because you're right about the blood sugar. It's like a train. It's going around in your body, the sugar over and around, and the gates are getting thick. And that's what's going on. Your cells are resistant. It goes around and around and around. Eventually, it doesn't let it in the gates. You got tons of sugar in your system, but it's not working. And then your body is being starved. When you're losing your legs, your eyesight, your extremities, the nurses tell me, you're being starved. That's what's going on. And your brain is starved.
Yeah. So, well, what's happening there, instead of a train, I would say it's more of what I'd call a roller coaster, because what happens is when you're eating all of the processed foods, all the foods that metabolize to glucose in our body, that drive that blood sugar. Now, every cell in the body, our neurotransmitters in our brain, which do need glucose, our red blood cells, which do need glucose, because neither of those things have mitochondria. And if a cell has mitochondria, it can run off of either. It can run off of glucose or off of ketones. But what happens is that if you're always going high with the stuff that drives the sugar or metabolizes the sugar, you can only have about 4 teaspoons of sugar in your bloodstream at any given moment. And so what happens is we become so used to running off of just sugar. That's why you heard me say sugar burner the other day. And that's the biggest thing when you talk about history. So you can't say our parents, because they were too much in the same era, especially if they're still around, as what we were. And even my grandparents, kind of made it into the 80s and 90s per se, or most of ours did. But if you go back to our great-grandparents' time, the biggest thing that is different is that, they ate, the core of their diet were animal proteins, eggs, fish that came probably somewhat regionally, locally, vegetables and fruits that were grown seasonally and locally. We just didn't have strawberries and raspberries on the shelf inside of, if we say Menominee Falls, where you and I grew up, Foodville, or Kohl's grocery store. Those things were around for a few months, and when you go through the evolutionary lens of where you mentioned hunter-gatherers and everything, and have to realize how long everything was. And so I've done a lot of looking at what the archaeologists and the anthropologists say, and who studied what was eaten through time.
Yeah.
And it's just incredibly fascinating that, you know, we were basically an animal based with some vegetables that you could can or turn into, you know, like a, you know, in other parts of the world where they had kimchi, kind of like a coleslaw that's fermented and things